Okay, so while the computer issues are solved, I would like to thank all of you. This presentation is more like a dialogue with you because, as Luana said, we belong from the other side of the world. The information we have is not very easy to access. There are no many translations. We belong to another tradition. Our tradition is mostly Catholic or Protestant. So it's a challenge for us to understand the things in the correct way and being fair with Nursi's thought. The title of my presentation, I try to do it very symbolic. Is the tree here. Said Nursi and moral philosophy, a hermeneutical approach. So my place of speech is the place of a person who studied philosophy in Colombia, that is my native country. So, of course, I am a daughter of the Western philosophy tradition. So that is the place of enunciation, since, well, I start to do this analysis of the text. Again. I would like to start with these epigraphs of one of my favorite Colombian writers. I like the docile world where I catch my fishes with the hook of a question. Because the most important thing in this exercise I am doing with Nursi's work is to ask questions. There are many questions, and that is the first step to the dialogue, especially in philosophy. Think about ontology is to think about questions and all the things that are, and that is lost to reflect on the essence of existence, the meaning and essence of being in conjunction with reality. This is, in terms of classic Greek philosophy, the logos of being. These issues, the ontological issues, for their depth and their complexity, they contain various types of analysis of existence of different kind of sources, universal and common entities with all their attributes and properties. These topics have generated questions, and these questions have been analyzed by brilliant minds over the centuries. All the questions about God, why are we here, the existence. In the case of the history of Western philosophy talked, from the counterpoint between Parmenides de Eleia, for example, and Heraclitus of Ephesus in ancient Greece, to the arguments discussed by philosophers like Kant, Husserl, or even Heidegger, a lot of questions are involving the ontological problem. Those questions have configured different transcendental problems that aim to analyze the diverse categories involving the being, its immanence, its existence considerations, and its discernment about different types of entities that compose all the things that are what they are. These philosophers and many other thinkers and scholars were configured from their reflections the narrative of thought of Europe, who meditates the questions that were showing and discussing their own concepts and phenomena, the history, and different other contexts. Ontology, as a philosophical discipline, is intended to approach these questions on some of the most complex issues to elucidate, as they involve the existence of God, the meaning of life, truth, and existence that belong to the scope of unintelligible and not all the things we could consider as tangible. The ontological reflections are anchored in the abstract terrain, and for this reason, they need a different approach from that we envisage concrete things. Speaking of ontology has been a long and difficult task throughout the history of philosophical thought, but it's important to briefly remember which way was talking the question of being in the 20th century, the same century in which Nursi lived. So, since my place of speech, I have that contrast between what was a challenge and what was important for Nursi and what was happening in the beginning of the 20th century in the history of the thought. Nursi, he studied these subjects inside his own historical, religious, political, and social perspective, and that is the reason why he has, in his arguments, a different perspective to the ontological analysis that was being made in Europe. Within Western philosophy, in the last decades of the 19th century and the 20th century, the ontology and a question of being led to thinkers like Husserl categorize it and the science of essence. It brings their issues to the academic discussions of the 20th century. Heidegger, for example, deeping in theoretical knowledge of his master Husserl in his book, Being and Time, the 1927, brings the ontology to the field of phenomenology, which will formulate an analysis of the existence, he will build his hermeneutics of facticity. With the formulation of Dasein, Heidegger opened the debate, established a philosophy of the 20th century that breaks with the philosophers based on the theory of knowledge and bringing new focus on ontology. The existential anguish of Dasein, that it was considered by Heidegger like the being for death, that even if the question be, this is why you configure the death of being, one who is thrown into the world, and that is the main part of Heidegger's analysis. Being on time in these issues is reflecting and creating a profound influence on philosophical studies of Western countries in the 20th century. So, while all these topics, Sartre's existentialism and the philosophy of science with philosophers like Popper, Kuhn, Lacan, Lakatos, were establishing another way for the being, they were establishing a world without God in the same century, in the world that was part of the end of the first and the second world. Nursi was thinking in another complete different way. So, for doing this study, Hans-Georg Gadamer said in his book, Truth and Method, Hans-Georg Gadamer was one of the most important hermeneutics of this century. He says that it's fundamental for understanding between two perspectives to know the horizon of meaning of the other one, aiming to avoid the misunderstandings. According to this, the understanding is not a personal achievement, but even that comes to interpreters to their encounter with others in an environment of dialogue. Again. So here we have like you can go. Okay. Here is the book of Heidegger that changes the focus of the being. It changes the focus of the being. So since Heidegger, much of philosophers and the philosophy tradition says that the perspective of what is important of the ontology absolutely changed in the 20th century. You can go again. Okay. So, what happened? How can I contrast these two horizons of meaning that look so different? So, according to my reading, Said Nursi proposed the moral ontology, a new moral ontology. Each of us is proof the scattered light of the existence of our Creator. Again. In the case of Said Nursi, theology carries his ontological reflection because all the questions by being, by the essence and the meaning of its existence are strongly linked to religious considerations, to the Quran and Allah as the architect of all that it is. It means in those three elements is the core of the meaning of existence in Nursi's consideration, the opposite side of Heidegger's Dasein, the opposite side of Sartre's existentialism, the anguish of the human being that is characteristic of the contemporary philosophy and the contemporary Western civilization. Okay, go. I did this. When I tried to do this presentation was in a dialogue with myself and thinking in other people that belongs to my tradition and they don't know anything about Nursi. So this presentation is thinking for this. God is explained by him as an ontological truth because without any doubt in the author's analysis, Allah exists, and in the fact of his existence, he sustains the sense of all that he created, the microcosm, the macrocosm, indeed, all that is. There can be no letter without a scribe, no law without a legislator. The cosmos also requires an infinitely wise, omniscient, and all-powerful manufacturer. So, using the science, as we know, he creates a new ontology that is linked to the moral philosophy that he has. It's impossible to think about a world so perfect as this one without a creator. Yeah? If we don't recognize that creator, we are breaking the link with their own creation, okay? Again. According to the symbolic logic of Nursi, who understands and explains the universe with the metaphor of a book, it's impossible to conceive that this book has not been written by any author. It's like to let behind the own essence of the human being. And probably the anguish of the Western in the 20th century is because they broke the link with the creator, and that creates anguish, and that creates that sensation of being just alone in the world. Oh my God. Okay. So, for finishing this part, this is a very complex issue. It's not easy to explain for me in just a few minutes, because other thing that is very, very important for doing this analysis is the language that Nursi uses for entering to these topics. The language of the metaphors, it's in his own a very symbolic way to understand that book of the cosmos and to create that ontology that is linked in a language that expresses what we are, because we say about our cosmos and about our context, because that is the tool we have to express. Our own language is the way to be close to that cosmos. So in Islam, when you say the names of Allah, when we read the book, is the word that led us to have that kind of connection. So the language, the moral philosophy, and the ontology are three linked elements to make an exegesis of Al-Quran that led us as Westerns, as daughters and sons of the Western civilization, to understand in what way he understood the world where he was living, even with all that convulsions and all that processes. And I think that is very important. I talked about that yesterday, for us to stop thinking about the Muslim world and the Western world like two worlds, like it was in the Middle Age. We are now living, and we need to establish bridges to understanding for avoiding the misconceptions and have a better understanding of our traditions and our thinkers as well. Thank you very much.